From Nashville, Tennessee, Music City, USA, and the home of hot chicken, it's the Rick Altizer Show. Sit back, buckle up. Rick will talk with the movers, shakers, and creators who put Christ in Christian entertainment. He's a man who's clear so the world can hear. Here's Rick Altizer.
Hey, thank you for joining me today. That was Bob Allen, the voice of The Rick Altizer Show. And I'm excited about my guest today. He is a film director. He is also an author. Was also in the Navy. What a story. But my guest today is Thomas Purifoy. Thomas, say hi to the audience.
How are you? It's great to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. We're excited to have you on. Thomas is the director of the movie, and you might have seen it or heard of it, called Is Genesis History? And that movie is actually, it was in theaters last year, did very well. It's very successful, a one-night event, as a Fathom event, and it's going to be back in theaters February 22nd. Here, 2018, this year, February 22nd, and it's in the Nashville area in quite a few theaters. So you can get information on that by going to isgenesishistory.com and see that movie. But Thomas, talk to me a little bit about how you came about getting involved in the movie Is Genesis History?
Well, the original idea came from a discussion I had with my then 10-year-old daughter. She's 14 now, so that shows how long ago it was. But she had just been watching a debate, the Ken Ham-Bill Nye debate, and a lot of questions came up. And I didn't have the answers for all of them. And I thought, I bet that there are other kids that are in the same boat. And sure enough, when I was in my youth group, I was teaching youth group at the time, I talked to a lot of kids and saw that they had a lot of questions. And so wondered if it might be useful to create a documentary to answer some of the questions that she was asking me and some questions I had. And one thing led to the next, and started to film a documentary. Actually, I spoke to a friend of mine who got involved as executive producer. I guess you've got to have funding first. That was the WTA group, a good friend of mine who, Bill Reeves, is the executive producer of the project.
We've had Bill on the show. Bill's been on the show.
He's a great guy, just really probably one of the best in the industry at looking for projects that are going to advance the kingdom, that he's really dedicated to looking at things, I guess, from an ideological perspective and understanding what might really have a resonance with people. And so Bill and I decided we were going to start this project, and so we did. Filmed it over a year, finished filming in June 2016, and ended up taking it to theaters. Bill took care of all the marketing for it, and then was in theaters February of last year. Fathom came back to us. It turned out it had been the second highest grossing event for last year. We were really surprised about that. The Lord was very gracious to it from that perspective. And so they said, we'd like to bring it back for an anniversary event. And so that's why we're coming back to theaters on February 22nd, which I guess is next month, for a one-night event. And we'll also have a new section we filmed at the Ark Encounter. So we just filmed a little documentary segment with 3 college students at the Ark Encounter just about a week and a half ago that is in color and final sound mix right now.
Oh, excellent. And that's going to be in addition to was it kind of like playing after the movie? They'll have a little extra?
Yes. Fathom Events requests that we do kind of an added value thing to make it an event. And so we'd originally had a Q&A with scientists, and they asked for something new. And I had really been doing some work with college students. And so Del Tackett, who also has a real heart for college students, he's been teaching at Summit Ministries for over 2 decades. He and I talked through it and thought it'd be really neat to interview 3 millennials, so a couple sophomores and a junior, to talk about what they were seeing on the college campuses, what their views were about young earth creation. And it really turned out great. I mean, I'm actually extremely excited about it. We've been showing that little segment around and are getting fantastic feedback because it's just a little unexpected to hear. We may let the kids talk and to let them talk about these issues and why they're important to them and why they think the way they do about them.
That's amazing. And Dr. Del Tackett is actually in the film. He's kind of the main narrator and kind of the guy who's leading us through the film. How did you hook up with Dr. Tackett?
I've been a big fan of his ever since the Truth Project and found it very useful. I've taught it in my youth group. It's just a great, great project. And I had ended up, we have a mutual friend that put us in touch earlier back when I did a project called Modern Parables. And we met, I think, one time at CBA, or no, it wasn't CBA, NRB, and here in Nashville. And so when I came out for this project, I was looking for really a guy that was respected, who was great on camera, who had scientific chops, who really could speak and handle his own in the scientific world, and who was a young Earth creationist. And Del was the perfect fit for this. He really was. This project could not have happened without him, and he really kind of sits at the center of the wheel here to make it all work. So Del was a blessing to have involved with Is Genesis History.
So the movie Is Genesis History. You directed it. What else were your other job titles on that movie?
Well, let's see. I got water for people, and I carried a lot of bags. No, I was, we usually work with a pretty small team here. So I was the producer and the director and the writer of the project. And so we had a handful of things. We all, as if you look in the credits, there aren't many folks in it. And so it's a small team that put all this together. So
talk to me as a director. How do you go about, putting together a movie on the creation of the world?
Oh, man, that was...
Of the universe.
Question. I mean, yeah, exactly. There's the world. It's the universe. You know, I struggled with that as a writer to figure out, there were so many different things and ways to talk about it. The question was, how do you put this together? So I'll be the first to say I'm not sure I solved it right. This was my solution of it. And what I came to was that these guys, all of them, as I talked to scientists, and I pre-interview everybody, and I read a lot of their books and kind of cast, if you will, the series through wanted only PhDs, people who were, had demonstrated some expertise in an area, and then who had written extensively in a certain area. So take Andrew Snelling, for example. He had his PhD and had actually worked in the mining industry in Australia, and actually had been on an Australian uranium commission. So had obviously demonstrated in even the secular world his expertise in this. And then since then has written for decades on radioisotope dating. So he was really the perfect guy to do that. So once I had him, the question is, well, how do we have them in a spot that really lets them demonstrate and can kind of have some visual illustration of this? And so for him, the best place to go, we realized, was a volcano. And we found an extinct volcano. Actually, I think it was Danny Faulkner that recommended the volcano we ended up at, which is an old crater that is down in Arizona. And so it seemed like a good fit. And so to direct it, I often was trying to say, how can I pull an expert and put them in an interesting visual location that will actually demonstrate and provide some visuals that show the evidence for what they're talking about. And so that was really kind of the model that I did over and over again. And I honestly, I would have loved to do walk and talks, but we ended up, just because of time, we kind of had to say, okay, let's find a good spot and talk, allow them to have a discussion, because a lot of this is just complex material. And so we get 2 or 3 hours of discussion, often in different areas, but it was still just two guys talking. And so that I then had to figure out how to structure these together. And so there was a kind of a logic to how I laid them out that seemed to be the one, if not the best. It seemed to be the best at the time to structure it, from the flood to the questions of the rocks to issues of biology to astronomy to archaeology and then to culture.
You're listening to the Rick Altizer Show here on Bot Radio, 89.1 FM, 1160 AM in Nashville. My guest today is director Thomas Purifoy, and we're talking about the movie Is Genesis History. It's going to be in theaters next month, February the 22nd, 2018, and it's going to be here in Nashville in quite a few theaters. And you can go to isgenesishistory.com and get more information about that. So you were talking about finding locations, and I know, too, I would imagine it'd be nice to go to Turkey and to go to Iceland and to go all over the world when you're doing a documentary on the creation of the universe. But then there's some budget constraints, so you've got to find a way to make all that happen.
No, it's very true. Now, it's interesting you mentioned Iceland. We were within a hair's breadth of going to Iceland for our end sequence. There's a really neat place, an island there called Surtsey Island that is a new island created in the 60s through volcanoes. And one of the geologists who later on saw it was like, okay, I think I'm watching millions of years of geological process happen in, days and weeks and months, primarily because the island has been re-inhabited. And essentially, if you were to look at it, you would have no idea that the island in many cases was younger than Del. That was a partly budget, partly because I felt it had reflected similar to our opening sequence in Mount St. Helens. But to be honest, a lot of we here in the United States don't realize how blessed we are that the American Southwest is probably one of the foremost places in the world that has been worked and can very easily see the layers of the earth, obviously primarily because of the Grand Canyon. But yes, there are some other spots it would have been great to go to, but our nation here and our continent has a fantastic geological representation that's very easy to get to and very accessible. So it actually worked out well.
How many different locations did you go to?
I think we filmed at 21.
Oh, my. Were they, and how many were out of the country?
So we actually, St. Thomas was officially the only one, quote, out of the country, and it was the U.S. Virgin Islands, so officially we were still in the country. Outside of CONUS, that's what I would say, of the continental United States, was only St. Thomas. The rest of them, I believe, were all somewhere on the continental United States.
Yeah, I was doing some thinking about that, especially that St. Thomas segment. I'm thinking like maybe a sequel. Is Genesis still history, and we just do it in St. Thomas, and I can go and I can be your assistant. I can help you out in that one.
Oh, yeah. that's very true. We'd love to go back. So Rob Carter, who has his, obviously, PhD in marine biology, had over 500 scuba dives, and he had not been scuba diving a long time. And he said, listen, I'll be happy to be in your film if you'll let me go scuba diving.
There you go.
That was great. I said, I'm going to put a camera down with you, Rob. And so that was it. They went scuba diving. I had a cameraman that was a scuba qualified, and he and Rob got all that footage.
I love it. Love it. Love it. So talk to me about putting, you approached Bill Reeves over at Working Title Agency, WTA, here in Nashville. So you just had an idea and you just approached him, and was that the genesis of that? I no pun intended. I really didn't intend that, actually. It just kind of came out. Was that what started that? Was just you and Bill kind of put this thing together?
It really is. I mean, I'd had the idea, and Bill and I talked about it on and off. It was an idea I had mentioned to Bill before. I've known Bill for years, and he and I were involved. Well, he got to know me through the Modern Parables project that I did about a decade ago. And really, I was beginning to look for funding for it, and it just started. And he and I sat down for breakfast, and we talked through it. And so I think because of our relationship, I think because Bill has been a 6-day creationist and has been a big supporter of those ministries for a long time. And I think has realized the importance of it, that this is really one of those key issues that it sometimes gets ignored in the church. A lot of people get uncomfortable, don't want to talk about it, because I know there are Christians that hold different views on it. But the traditional view that the earth was created in 6 days, that there was a global flood, there was a real Adam and Eve, there was a real Tower of Babel. These are all things the church has always held, and the Bible pretty clearly seems to teach this, especially if you look at what the New Testament authors looking back at these events are saying. So I think Bill and I, we really met on that point, that it was less interested in creating a documentary that would be, perhaps stand on its own, be a piece of art, although we think the Lord was gracious and it has some very pretty vistas in it. Both he and I were very committed, thinking this was a message that needed to get out. And that was where we really saw eye to eye on. And so, we were in lockstep from the beginning on this.
And again, some of the imagery is so beautiful. Seeing it on a big screen makes such a difference. And it's going to be here in theaters locally this February the 22nd. You can get information by going to isgenesishistory.com. You can find out which theaters. I know it's at Opry Mills and down in Franklin, and it's pretty much all over town. Talk to me about who can go see this. Is this something that you'd want to take your children to, and why it's important? If to take your children, why is it important to take them to this?
Well, I actually usually recommend folks, or give people a caveat. It's not quite a PG-13, and it would not be called that for any content in it in terms of anything negative. But the material is pretty dense. I mean, I've got 13 scientists going. So you would want to take, I would say, a middle school student that was probably a little more geared to science would be interested, and then possibly move up from there. I think a lot of it was designed for students, but I think that it just needs a little pre-work. We have a lot of materials on our website. A lot of pre-work could be done to discuss concepts, to discuss some ideas, simply because curiously enough, what we're finding is the film has been watched many times. I know it sounds strange, but kind of a binge watching on different ways. We'll hear people on our social media, they'll say, oh, I've seen the film 7 or 8 times. And I think the reason for that is it's very dense. There's a lot of material, and it's very evidence-based with a lot of data in it. And so obviously there are a lot of folks that say this is a crazy idea. I can't believe young Earth creationists, pseudoscience, they're nuts, et cetera, et cetera. And so the way I wanted to approach it was to provide a lot of supporting evidence and data to show that, no, these guys really it's a very reasonable way of looking at it from this paradigm. But the result is that for students, it can be a lot. And so I think that it's designed for students. And a lot of kids have said how much they love it, but just kind of realize that if they're too young, they probably are not going to get much out of it and might even get a little bored. 10 and below is possibly young.
Let's say I'm a youth group leader, right? And I teach, middle school and high school at my church. And I know what my kids are exposed to in school and what they're exposed to on the History Channel and Discovery Channel. Why is it important for me as a youth group leader to grab a group of my students and take them to see this film?
Well, what the film really tries to do is in one sitting pull together all of the various strands of evidence and show how they all fit together in light of what Genesis is saying. And so what most parents and youth group leaders, what they intuitively understand is that there is a story that is being told. And whether it's in the media, whether it is in Marvel Comics movies, whether it is in your textbooks, is of a old, billions of years old Earth in which death has always been around, in which the biblical text really can't be trusted in its view of history, and it gets from every direction. It's pushed there. So what we try to do is put in one place to say, well, look, recognizing this is a high level, because every one of these guys spent much more time in it, but at a high level, it gives you an overview showing that there are very smart people, as Del Tackett, you say, scary smart, that have looked at all the evidence in a much greater detail than pretty much 99.99% of the population, and are saying, you know what, I think it's reasonable that when you look at it from this paradigm and you look at it from what the Bible is saying, that really the Bible is just a pretty good book of history. And so I think it's useful for students, even if they don't understand everything that's being said, to realize that there are a lot of folks who do understand it and do accept young Earth creation and do accept the model of history that's presented in the Bible. And so in a way, it is an opening, it's a doorway that people can walk through if they want and start learning more. And so no one's going to walk out of here being an expert in genetics or an expert in geology or an expert in any number of areas we talk about. But their eyes may be open to things they've never seen before. And so even if they don't remember everything, the process of having the eyes open and saying, you know what, perhaps this is reasonable is probably a big encouragement to a lot of these kids that they can trust what the Bible says, even though their society and their schools may say it's not trustable.
You're listening to the Rick Altizer Show on Bot Radio, 89.1 FM, 1160 AM, Nashville. My guest today is director Thomas Purifoy, and he is the director of the movie Is Genesis History? Let's say a visual apologetic for the biblical account of creation. And you can get information about the movie, and it's actually going to be in theaters February 22nd, 2018. February 22nd here in Nashville, and you can get information about that and about the movie at isgenesishistory.com. You know, Thomas, I've had quite a few apologetics on the show. I've had J. Warner Wallace and Frank Turek, and talk to me about, this was just my theory, but the movie was so successful last year when it came to theaters for the first time. One of the most successful faith-based, I think it's the most successful faith-based movie Fathom's ever had, and it was the number 2 overall most successful for the whole year. Talk to me about why you think that was the response was so so amazing.
Well, we did talk about this a little bit after the film because it kind of surprised us, and what I like to think of it was really just like, drilling for oil. Sometimes you hit a spot, and when a lot of oil comes out, the guy that's drilling really has nothing to do with it. It's already in the ground. And I think that there is a pent-up interest in this topic because the church, in many cases, has ignored it for a long time. I had a pastor tell me one time, he said, I think a lot of pastors have taken an agnostic stand on Genesis 1 because they don't want to offend anybody in their church. Or they, as another pastor told me one time, a very articulate guy who understands how pastors think, he's been teaching them for decades, he said a lot of them don't really understand the material, so don't want to get into discussion because they're kind of at a first grade level themselves, and they really need to be at a sixth, so to speak, and they don't really want to talk about this because it's complex. So I think that, however, our culture is hammering Christians left and right on these topics. They see it when they open Time magazine, some new hominid fossil, skeleton or a skull or whatever has been discovered. They hear some new discussion about the age of humans. You hear some discussion about the age of the earth. And they pick up their Bibles and they open it to the first chapter, and it seems to suggest that it was done in 6 days. And even they realize that those Christians that have adopted an old earth have to also adopt billions of years of death, which really kind of impugns God's character of being a good God, creating a very good world. Well, how does a very good world have billions of years of suffering, death, of animals and creatures, and just a universe that is, let's be honest, if you follow the conventional view of the world, for 9 billion years, there wasn't even an Earth in the universe, much less, any animals or creatures. So I think that they intrinsically and intuitively understand this and have just realized that very few places in the media have actually explored this and addressed it. So I think the film scratched an itch that was there, and I think it's still, it's clearly something that people are interested in, continue to be interested in.
Yeah, and we saw with God's Not Dead. We saw how well that went with Pureflix. I just think that the issue of apologetics and the proof text that the Bible is what it says it is actually true. I think that is definitely you hit a nerve in our in our church right now, and you can see this movie. You can take your youth group, you can take your high school student, you can take your middle school student, you can go with your spouse. This February the 22nd, 2018. At many theaters here in Nashville, and you can find out where by going to isgenesishistory.com. So, Thomas, talk to me about what you've got on the books coming up for you personally.
Well, we've still got a lot of material to finish with this. We have recently put out a Bible study and have started into our first volume of 3 volumes, what we're calling Beyond is Genesis History. The first volume was The Rocks and the Fossils, and it was 20 20-minute videos looking at just the geologists and the paleontologists that we interviewed. And we've still got the volume 2, it's his life and design, and volume 3, Stars in the Bible. And if I can do it, I'd like to write a kind of a summary book of all the arguments in kind of a tight, simple way that would kind of be an overall book from the film that kind of are my takeaways. I think, and it goes back to this question of apologetics, I think really it's interesting. I didn't approach the film apologetically, although I can understand why it's been used that way, and it can be used that way. To me, I think I would hope to see Christians really have their eyes opened about science, and in a way not to be scared of science, but to embrace it, and not necessarily look for arguments, but rather to look for the truth that is in the world around us. And I think that there are a lot of both Christians and non-Christians who don't actually know the scientific data. And so as you go to the data and begin looking at it through this, from the standing on the book of Genesis, it has a very strong apologetic result, but even more so, I think it ends up in giving us a kind of a wonder and a worship of our Lord, who has created this really incredible world. And so I think if anything can go away that people can take away from it, is really kind of a new wonder at the creation, and really just kind of an astonishment at what God has done, that we can see all around us when we walk outside and look at the trees or look,
Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, you can get more info at isgenesishistory.com. It's in theaters February the 22nd, 2018. And Thomas, our time is up, and I just want to thank you so much for sharing. And I love how you closed it out. It leads us to the wonder of how awesome God is. That's a great way to close the show. So thank you so much for being on the show today, Thomas.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. And they can get more info at isgenesishistory.com. Thanks for joining me. The music you are listening to is from my scripture memory record, and I want to give it to you for free. Just go to my website, rickaltizer.com, and click Contact. Altizer is spelled Altizer. Or how about liking my Facebook page, facebook.com/Rick Altizer Show. And I want to thank you for listening. So be sure to check us out again next week as we discuss how we communicate the gospel through media to our culture. Let's be clear so the world can hear. I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening.